What I'd like to do today is talk a bit about PHP, sort of its history and my history with it, because I've sort of grown up with PHP, been working with it for over 15 years now, and watched it come and go, and watched some of the amazing things that have happened with it. And so we'll take you through a little bit about that and talk a bit about the future. In 1997, I lived in a little town west of here called Ascot. You ever heard of that? They do some races or something there. And I was really interested in photography, and I bought a Contax G1 camera. I imagine most of you have never heard of Contax. They really didn't make the transition into the digital world, and the brand is really not around much anymore. But I was on a mailing list of people that had Contax G and cameras, and that was really enjoyable until the list sort of crashed and went down, and then we couldn't get in touch with each other anymore. So I actually went out and set up a website so that the people with the Contax Gs could actually share photos with each other. Tim OReilly, about 5 years later, coined the term Web 2.0. And one of the things that meant was that sites had user-generated content. They had commenting. They had the ability to share. They had the ability for people to customize their experience. A lot of that was sort of embodied in Flickr, if you remember when Flickr was released back in 2004, 2005. And got really popular. Well, my site had all of those features about 4 or 5 years before Flickr did. But I was really a novice at programming. I was a novice to the web, and I really made some dumb mistakes. Some of you immediately laugh at this. That's almost an exact line of code in there. So I had no concept that HTTP had different verbs. I just thought there was a page and it had links, and if you wanted the links, you would do something based on the link. So you'd upload an image, and there was a link there next to it that said if the user wanted to delete that image, they could delete it. So we launched the site, 50 or 60 people logged on, uploaded images. About 2 hours later, Google came and crawled the site, hit all the links. Suddenly, everything was gone again. They say that good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from bad decisions. So this was a step on my way to getting experience here. And part of my evolution was the evolution of technology. Technology evolves, and I think technology on the web and associated with that evolves faster than almost any other technology anywhere. Y'all may have heard the story, which is actually somewhat apocryphal, that the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle were designed with a width of approximately 4.5 to 5 feet so that they could be carried on rail cars because they had to be transported from the place they were manufactured to the launch pad for assembly and everything else like that. Well, why do they have to fit that width? Well, the rail cars were dictated by the width of the train tracks, right? Where did the width of the train tracks come from? Well, they came from the train tracks in England, where the train was invented. Well, where did that width come from? That came from the wagon tracks in the roads from where the wagons were. Because if the wagons weren't the right width to fit the ruts, that they would bounce all over the place and shake the goods up. Well, you push that back further, where did that width come from? And it turns out you trace that all the way back to the Roman chariots. And so basically the most modern form of transportation in the world, the space shuttle, has design constraints that were imposed by the Roman chariot thousands of years ago. Now the fact is, that's not actually true in a literal sense. You can go to Snopes.com and read up a bit more about it. But it does have a truth that technology is constantly varying, but it's also constrained by the past. So my past constrained me into learning a bit more about HTTP. It learned more about the web and how to build things. And I learned more about PHP, starting with PHP 3. I rewrote the site in PHP 4, and then we moved on a bit. Now, y'all may remember that. How many of y'all worked with PHP 3? Okay, the good old days of PHP programming. You didn't have to worry about classes. You didn't have to worry about objects. Everything was a global, right? You didn't have to implement any extra code to get SQL injection. It like came free with the package there. Cross-site scripting, none of us had ever heard of that. You had an include file, you included a variable in the path. Wow, someone could just set a global variable somewhere and suddenly you're loading someone's code from another site. It was really awesome. One of the great things about PHP though was that it was simple. Anyone could install a package and literally within 4 or 5 minutes be running a web server that had PHP on it and get stuff up and running. And that's one of the great things about PHP is that that's still true today, is that it's still about the easiest way to actually get something working. When I rewrote that photo sharing site, I turned it into a generic package called SiteFrame. If you're a fan of horror films or something, you can go look at siteframe.org and actually download it, but I really, really strongly recommend that you do not run this on any sort of publicly accessible web server, unless you're sort of trying to find out who can hack you, because it's very good at enabling that. But it's a learning experience to sort of see what happened in the good old days and why they're not so good. PHP 4 came along and wow, all this yummy, yummy goodness, right? We have object-oriented programming, which was the hot new thing. It was the first real step of PHP into the modern programming world. It used modern paradigms and modern ways of thinking. It used encapsulation. It had a whole bunch of features that made it much more stronger for developers to use. That's continued in the following years. Multiple different releases. The most major one coming up was PHP 5.3, which really revolutionized things. That was sort of when PHP was launched into the modern era of programming. And it had support for closures. Oh my God, we're becoming Lisp here, right? Anonymous functions. A lot of the complaints that people had about PHP were solved by PHP 5.3. And really for the first time, PHP was arguably as advanced a language as the core language as Ruby or Python or one of the other more modern type languages. And no one really cared. PHP 5.3 came out and almost no one used it. And it was a wonderfully circular situation that we got into because hosting providers said, well, no one is asking me for PHP 5.3, so I'm not going to install that one. It breaks things and it's backwards incompatible. Application developers said, none of the hosting providers support PHP 5.3, so I'm not going to write my applications with it. And then the hosting providers used the fact that none of the application developers were requiring 5.3 as a reason for why they didn't need to upgrade. And it was sort of a stalemate in the market there for several years where PHP 5.3 was out, it had all these wonderful features, and no one could use it at all. Now I'm going to steal a little bit here from a guy named Larry Garfield. A lot of you may know him. He's given a talk at several conferences before where he talked about the changes that happened with that. And the biggest change that happened was that PHP, until that point, did not have sort of a community around it. That's what was missing in the PHP world compared to, say, the Python or the Ruby world. If you go to Python, if you're anything to do with Python, you go to PyCon, right? Everyone goes there. There is one language conference for the Python programming language. If you're in Ruby, over here, you go to RubyConf. Everyone does it. There's one central place. In the PHP realm, there was 145 different conferences. There was no single community, and in fact, there was a lot of pushback against that because there was sort of a feeling that this was a hobbyist's language and we didn't need to get into those sorts of things. Like I said, Larry Garfield talks a lot about this because what he did, along with a number of other people, I'm calling him out because he wrote the presentation here, that they got together and formed something called the Framework Interop Group, FIG. And that was important because frameworks were big then. One of the statistics he throws out that the average PHP programmer has written 2.43 frameworks. Everyone likes that one. But what they did is they set a plan to say, okay, we're some of the core application developers. He works for Drupal, and there's a number of others that said, okay, we're going to require PHP 5.3. So all at once, July of 2007, I think, they all said, we're going to require PHP 5.3 on our next one, and we're going to deprecate all older releases. Within 6 months of that pressure, most of the major hosting providers had gotten the message and they had started supporting PHP 5.3. That really started the ball rolling with the whole concept of community and with PHP moving into the modern era. There's a number of other things that PHP didn't have beforehand. They didn't have a really standard, easy-to-use way to package things up, right? Python has pip, Ruby has gems, PHP had pair, but you really couldn't get stuff into pair unless you were one of the pair guys, and then you had to have it reviewed by 17 people, and you couldn't just sort of create a package and share it with someone like that. Symfony came along, Composer, that was adopted by the Framework Interoperability Group, and suddenly we had a way to share stuff. Anyone could do it. It lowered the barrier there, just like to the language, so that anyone could share code with one another. And that was a huge benefit to the community there. What that means is, we didn't have to write code anymore. We could reuse code. And that's probably one of the single greatest things that the PHP community has done for itself, is go to the open source model where we borrow code, we share code, and we give back. We don't have to write everything from scratch. This addressed some of the key issues. Gentlemen and I were talking here earlier before the talk started that, you know, in Python, there's 1 or 2 HTTP wrappers that you use. In Ruby, there's a standard library that you use. In PHP, there's 147. And probably more than that if you count the ones that people had written on their own, just for the fun of it. Well, with Composer, with Symfony, you now had a way to build sort of standard packages. You could let the best ones win. And in the future, there's going to be 2 or 3 that are common that everyone uses, and that's going to make it much more powerful for the PHP community. How many of y'all are familiar with this website, this web page specifically? If you're a PHP coder, I encourage you to read this. It's webonastick.com. It's called Why PHP Sucks. If you go Google Why PHP Sucks, this is the first result here. And it's a very sort of short-winded rant about everything that's bad about PHP. You should know what's bad about your language. If nothing else, then you can sort of be prepared to talk to the people who talk bad about you. And he goes through a number of issues, and really, I don't think a lot of the claims here hold a lot of weight. They're basically saying, I disagree with some of your design decisions. You know, in PHP, a logical operator returns true or false, 1 or 0. In other languages, it doesn't. It returns the left side or the right side of the comparison, which may make it more useful. On the other hand, you could argue that it's not as explicit. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and this is a common opinion out there. It's a real good resource down at the bottom of that page that says, here are other anti-PHP sites. Some of these are legit. If you read that first one, PHP, a fractal of bad design, that's actually got some seriously well thought out arguments as to some of the design flaws inherent in the PHP language. I'm not going to dwell on it, but you should be aware of those sorts of things. But one of the things it tells me is that PHP is actually being taken seriously as a general purpose programming language, which is something that wasn't true in the past. What we know about PHP, however, is that people make money with it. Lots and lots and lots of money, unlike Python, unlike Ruby, unlike Java. 72% of the sites on the web are written in some form of PHP. About half of them are written in PHP 3. Facebook, Yahoo, Wikipedia, those are 3. 6 of the top 10 sites on the web are all written in some form of PHP. It's the language that startups use. Why? It's low cost, it's easy to get into, it's ubiquitous, you can find people skilled in it. You don't have to rely on any sort of esoteric knowledge. And PHP was really built to be easy to use and start up, but it was never intended to be a general purpose language. I used to work for Yahoo when Rasmus Lerdorf was there, and he was insistent that PHP was never supposed to be a general purpose programming language. It was a templating language for HTML. It was a way to get dynamic data into an HTML page, and that's really all it was for. So he pushed back against that for years. Luckily, he's turned around a bit, and we're getting more of the modern features in there. But it shows that PHP has grown. It shows that people are using PHP for doing massive amounts of things on the web, and more importantly, they're successful with it, and they're making money with it. So now we get all the sophistication and glamour of PHP. It really is sort of an ugly duckling of a language. No one really likes to admit they're a PHP programmer sometimes, especially if you're around the cool kids that are doing Clojure and some of the other Haskell or whatever. If you're in a bar or pub and people are saying, "Oh, I'm writing in Scala," you sort of go, "Oh, PHP." Let me get you a drink. They're the cool ones. I'm a pragmatist. I tend to say, if the language lets me get the job done without too much expense and without too much error, then I'll use it. And that's where PHP is. It's the pragmatist's language. The language shouldn't necessarily be blamed for all of the defects that people put into it. And you can code in badly in any sort of language. Now, you know as well as I do that a lot of these people here and you and there are doing amazing things in PHP. And part of the problem has been that there hasn't been a single PHP community like in Ruby or Python. The strength of PHP has been in lower level grassroots conferences like this. There's 600 people here. PyCon this year, the major one in North America, will have 4,000 attendees. They'll have 1,000 or 2,000 at the ones in Europe and in Canada and in Australia. So they have a much more centralized community. Ours is much more distributed, more dispersed, more spread out. But it's at events like this where people learn how to do things better. They learn best practices. They share with one another how to get things done. And they also focus on some of the features of the language itself. We've actually become a force to be reckoned with, and as the framework Interop group has shown, we can actually make changes to that environment out there. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about where PHP is going. As you know, the title said PHP's future is in the clouds. I think the future is bright. There are some things that need to change along with PHP as we go into the future here. One is that we're still building applications like we used to. Specifically, we're treating an architecture as a static construct that can't be changed. I gave a talk yesterday on how to bring down a website, and we talked about architecture a bit. And one of the people in there said, you work for months and months and months to try to convince upper management to spend some money to get some hardware. And then finally you get the approval, and you have 3 days to define your architecture so you can make that purchase and then get on with building the system. The implication there is that architecture is a static thing. You do it once, you spend the money, and then you can't ever come back to the well again. But what happens if the architecture, if the hardware itself is free, or at least so low cost that you don't actually have to worry about the pricing of it, right? We're less hesitant to do that for a good reason. When we try something new in our code, we'll often create a prototype, right? How many of y'all just play around with things to see how they work? I wrote a blog post that really resonated with a lot of people. It says if you're a programming manager, you need to let your people play, because that's how they learn new things, that's how they figure out what works, and that's how you sort of grow your skill base. We can do that with code, but until recently haven't been able to do that with hardware. Well, what I'd like to tell you is that yes, we can do that with hardware. We can, spin up servers in a moment, play with it, see how it works, spin them down and delete it when we're done, right? There's literally almost no overhead cost for this, and we can test those assumptions. If you want to change your architecture, it's much cheaper and easier to do it now than it ever has been before. And so I want to talk through a couple of scenarios here about how that works. This is from the Rackspace PHP library. Y'all don't need to get in the details of this, but essentially, you connect to something, you authenticate, one line of code, you can create a server. Right? Voila, that's hardware via code. In other words, hardware is not a purchase order, an approval chain, an installation, an ops guy who has to run things, a network guy who has to plug it in and get it connected. It's one line of code in a PHP script, and suddenly you have a new server, or you have a new storage device, or you have a new load balancer, or you have a new Redis database, or something like that. That's really all you need to understand. If you want to try to change things, prototype, build something and see how it works. Measure everything. The cost of a virtual server is like a few tens of currency units, whether those are dollars or pounds or euros. A new hardware is thousands of currency units, right? So this is easy. This is a standard sort of model for a service-oriented architecture, right? We've got a web front end, you have an API back end, and you have some sort of cache. Do you know when that breaks? What is your performance level there? You measure that, right? What happens if you have multiple front ends going through a single cache into the back end there? Where does it fail? Does it fail at the API layer? Does it fail at the cache? Or do you not have enough front ends yet? You need to try that out and measure it. What happens if we add multiple API servers? Are we now overwhelming the cache? All those questions you should be able to answer. In 2006, I helped launch Yahoo Tech, which was sort of a gadgets and gizmos review site. And it was the first service-oriented architecture that we had built within Yahoo. So we had not done this before. We said, we don't want to do premature optimization, so let's build it once, test it, and see if we need caching. You want to guess what the response was? We needed caching. Our throughput on the site after our first round of tests was 0.6 requests per second. That's all we could handle. Now, we were going through a front end, API layer. The API itself was calling a dozen or 24 other services within Yahoo. So it was really sort of a worst case situation. We tried probably 50 different configurations of the architecture here, all using physical hardware, and we ended up with something that looked like this. We had front end servers with a local squid cache running on each server, a central squid cache that was actually a parent of the others, and then a pool of back-end servers. The middle layer cache was actually a cluster, but we don't need to get into all the details. It seems very logical, but the addition of those extra little tiny caches on the front-end servers improved performance by about 25% and improved the overall throughput of the system. And it makes sense when you think about it, because if you're serving a web page, 90% of the time you're serving the most common featured content, right? If you're talking about the iPhone, then it's the iPhone article that's everywhere, and you want it cached everywhere. By having a cache hit up there on the front-end server, you don't have any network overhead. You're just serving it locally. It's effectively as if you're serving a static web page on the front side there. Coming up with that configuration took literally weeks, if not months of time. So I would sit there for week after week trying various things out to see what worked best. And in fact, if we had had virtualization, we probably could have written a script that would run overnight and would have let us know the next day or two which one of those configurations was best. How many of y'all have a pet? Right? We used to treat servers like pets, right? How many of you have a server that has a name? Right? You know its quirks. You know when it's going to act up. If it gets sick, you stay up with it at night, you take care of it, right? We want them to be around as long as possible, right, when we have a server out there. But really, the modern era, we're going to treat servers like cattle. I don't know their name, right? If it gets sick, I'm going to drag it over to the side and get another one, right? I'm interested in the end product. I want beef. I don't care which cow it comes from. I don't care which server my job is running on. As long as I can get another one quickly and easily, that's what we're going to go with. So I want to summarize a few of the things I've gone through here today. It's not real complicated. First, PHP isn't the same language that it was a few years ago, right? The language has matured and developed, and yet it's still the simplest, easiest way to get something started and get something built. Second, In the last few years, PHP has really built a community that encourages sharing and reuse of code like never ever before. That by itself will help push PHP into the future easily. Finally, now that we have software tools we need to write awesome code, we can turn those same tools to working on architectures, optimizing the performance. We can treat hardware as ephemeral, and we can create prototypes that achieve the desired performance and test all the things, measure everything, and understand why things are doing it the way they're doing. So I'm not a PHP prophet. I'm not really a bigwig. I'm just a guy who writes code. I'm not going to tell you how to run your business, which providers to use, though obviously I have an opinion. What I'd love to do is have you leave here with a better understanding of what's available, what you're capable of, and how you can do it. Any of y'all recognize this statue? It's about 600 yards from here up on City Road. It's John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And I understand that a lot of you here probably wouldn't agree or understand or care about his theology. I'd like to leave you with one of his more profound statements, which is to do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you can. That's a great message for our community. I think of that as sort of an 18th century forerunner of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes. Thank you very much.